compensation. The British paid them off with an enormous amount of money. But in the U.S., the slave owners they do not want any plan that will, and I think if we think of the Civil War, Civil War is a horrible thing. 700,000 or more people were killed. Terrible. You show me a scenario to get rid of slavery in this country peacefully. There is none. If Delaware, with 1,800 slaves, will not accept Lincoln's compensated gradual emancipation plan, how is Mississippi going to agree to get rid of slavery? How is South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama going to agree to get rid of slavery? Nope, they never will. Sad to say. So, that's why there's a civil war. It's a terrible thing, but it rid the country of this horrible institution.
Did you talk about the debates you had with Professor Oaks about confiscation acts?
Debates? I don't know they were debates exactly. We were trying to figure out because the Confiscation Act is a very confusing law.
So we have some people that.
So yes, maybe you have it figured out.
I've certainly been very confused by the second Confiscation Act.
The second one, okay.
Yeah. And you were just talking about the distinction between slaves and other forms of property. And in the law, the distinction is clear. And I found it easy to say, it's not very good law in terms of confiscating property, but in terms of slaves and their labor, I've been very confused in terms of actual figures.
Yeah, these laws were both compromises, patched up in Congress, pulling together pieces of other proposals, and they don't all necessarily fit together. By the way, a lot of laws of Congress are like that, so it's not the only case where Congress passes things, and then people say, what the heck is this, actually? What does it mean? But the first Confiscation Act, August 1861, only applies to slaves used for military purposes. So it applies to some of those contrabands, but not all. If a slave used for, working for the Confederate Army runs away, then the government will free him, basically, is what it says. Not most slaves it doesn't apply to, obviously. The second Confiscation Act, on paper, seems to apply to most of the slaves in the South, right? It seems to say that any time, now it's only slaves of rebels. If you can prove you're a loyal slave, if you're a slave owner of the Union and you're loyal to the Union, it doesn't apply to you. But most slave owners were rebels. So what does it say? It says that the government that slaves who come within Union lines, that means either they run away or the army moves into an area where the slaves are there, will become free, basically. Is there a process? I mean, who's going to determine if the owner is loyal or not? Doesn't say. How do we know they're free? Do they get a certificate from somebody, from the army, from a judge? There's a whole process for confiscation of property, landed property. That requires a judicial procedure. But the freeing of the slaves in the Confiscation Act seems to be automatic in some way. There's no procedure. It's sort of self-enforcing. But of course, as you say, it's all very confusing because it's unclear how it will actually operate and what will give a legal guarantee to these people. So on the one hand, it did offer promise of freedom to a lot of people. On the other hand, it was very murky exactly how that would work out in practice. So everyone is confused by that. What Professor Oaks and I were confused, what we were debating this little clause of the first Confiscation Act, it turned out that I was correct, by the way. The reason was this. I was going from the actual text of the law as printed in what they call the statutes of the United States. Every year they print a book saying, here's the laws that were passed. So I looked at that book. Here it is. Oaks was going from a book on the first Confiscation Act by a woman named Siddelli, and at the end of her book, as an appendix, she prints the first Confiscation Act. So that would seem to be pretty authoritative, but she printed the wrong version. She printed the wrong, something that had been in Congress, but not the final version that was passed. So we were both right, in a sense. He was talking about Sideli's version, and I was talking about the one that was finally passed. But it seemed like, until we kind of compared notes and said, well, wait a minute, this is not what it really says. That's why we couldn't quite get on the same page.
Okay, so you had said you only had 1 hour.
Yeah, an hour, a little bit long. I could stay maybe two. I got an appointment back up at Columbia at 3.
Do some people not have class? Put up your hand if you don't have class now.
If you don't have class, you're welcome to stick around for another, let's say, 10 minutes if you want, and then we can. But I do have to go by about a quarter
You
of.
have to go. Why don't you get out of here?
Get out, yeah. Okay, thank you all. Nice to see you.
Are you saying? Do you want Yeah. I don't know if it's like Thank you very much. Yeah, Can you sign my pen?
Yeah, I don't want to sign everything.
Can you ask one? Wait, Charles, can you ask the last question? Okay, I gotta give it.
Right. There you go. Sure.
Okay.
Okay, sure. Good to see you.
Monster book sign.
It's 10 minutes.
Well, Lincoln said they would. Now, of course, Congress would have to appropriate the money. But, Congress, when it abolished slavery in Washington, D.C., several months after that, appropriated money. Maybe they didn't trust Congress. I don't know. But I don't think so. I think